Prisoner and the Rats, An Ode to the Lion and the Mouse by Aesop. The damp stone cell swallowed him whole. Its walls oozed moisture, slick with centuries of neglect, and the torch sputtered against the thick shadows like a hesitant heartbeat. He stumbled inside, fetid straw crunching beneath his boots, and fell to the floor with a grunt. The door clanged shut behind him, iron biting into stone, and he realized with a chill that no human voice would interrupt the silence for days, weeks, perhaps. At first, he did not notice the eyes. They gleamed faintly in the torchlight, twin sparks in corners, and beneath the cracks of the floorboards. The rats came at night, scuttling, gnawing, relentless. Their tiny claws tapped like 1,000 tiny hammers, scratching against the stone. He hurled stones, kicked at the shadows, cursed them in a rasping voice that no one would hear. Filthy scavengers, he spat. Vermin unworthy of the world. Yet in the darkest hours, he could not escape their presence. He imagined them chewing at his fingers while he slept, stripping flesh from bone with tiny, desperate jaws. He pulled the straw over his head and whispered prayers to any god who would listen, though his voice cracked with terror. Time, however, is a patient tutor. Days bled into weeks, and the prisoner's anger soured into despair. No guard came, no visitor crossed the threshold. Silence became his companion, and he began to notice details he had ignored in the rush of fear. The rats were clever. Not mindless pests, but creatures with method. They scouted before venturing near, tested dangers with tentative nibbles, and shared scraps among themselves. He watched them with something close to awe. Hunger gnawed at him in turn. One evening, he tore his stale bread into fragments and tossed a crumb to the largest rat. It froze, sniffed, and then, as if emboldened by loneliness, took it. Then another, until a small crowd of gray and brown shapes clustered around his hand, sniffing and nibbling. He muttered to them, at first in bitterness, then with a strange gentleness. You're smarter than I thought," he said. "Better than I deserved." He did not know whether they understood, but in that whisper there was no mockery, only companionship. One day he found a bit of reed in the straw. Over the following days, he was able to craft it into a crude flute. The rats seemed intrigued. They always came to watch when he played. It was the same tune in his head over and over again. But it and the rats that somehow kept him sane. Weeks later, the storm came. Rain lashed at the castle walls, pouring through cracks in the roof and soaking the straw beneath him. He shivered violently, teeth chattering, breath ragged. His hands felt like ice blocks, his joints stiff with cold, his strength faltering. The world narrowed to a thin line between life and death. Then they came. Not one or two, but a writhing mass of rats, clambering over him, burrowing into the straw, pressing warm bodies against his freezing skin. He froze at first, terror flaring, but the heat was real, steady, and somehow deliberate. They shielded him, their small bodies forming a barrier against the icy wind and rain. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, alive only because of them. When he woke, he whispered thanks instead of curses, and for the first time in months, he smiled at their bright, gleaming eyes. The next day, the guards returned to drag him before the court. The trial was a grotesque parody of justice. False witnesses spat rehearsed lies. The judge yawned as if bored by the mere act of listening, and a crowd leaned forward to savor the spectacle of another man's ruin. The prisoner's fate was sealed before the first words were spoken. He was condemned to hang at dawn. Bound by rough ropes, he was returned to his cell for the night to contemplate death, his wrists chafing raw. The walls seemed to close in, and despair coiled around his heart like a living thing. He sat huddled in the corner, staring at the torchlight's feeble dance, feeling the hours stretch endlessly. And then he felt them, nibbling at his wrists, small teeth tugging at the fibers of the ropes. He froze, disbelief and terror warring with hope. The ropes fell loose in a heap around his elbows. The rats scattered to the corner of the cell, to an iron grate that covered the sewer mouth. The sound of their teeth scraping against metal filled the cell, accompanied by tiny claws scratching stone. All night he listened, shivering not from fear, but anticipation. The grate gave way, rust and corrosion yielding to their relentless assault, until a black hole yawned before him, reeking of rot and shadow. He peered into the depths, the stench nearly making him gag, and then realized the impossible. The rats were inviting him. Lowering himself into the sludge, he felt the cold slime wrap around his legs. The rats poured in after him, their squeaks echoing through the tunnels like a strange chorus of encouragement. He crawled blindly, nearly faltering in panic, until instinct guided him. The rats darted ahead, and he followed the faint glimmer of their eyes, the sound of their tiny claws on stone guiding him through the labyrinth of darkness. Time lost meaning. Minutes bled into hours, or perhaps only moments. It was impossible to tell. His lungs burned, his muscles ached, and the reek of sewage clung to him like a second skin. Yet always the rats were there, moving, squeaking, urging him onward. At last, he glimpsed moonlight glinting off the metal lip of a storm drain. With a final, ragged effort, he heaved himself through the opening, coughing, choking, and collapsed into the forest beyond. He lay on the cold earth, shivering and gasping for air, while the rats lingered, their small eyes reflecting the pale moon. Slowly, he rose, brushing mud from his clothes, feeling the weight of disbelief and gratitude in equal measure. The prison, the ropes, the court, all of it seemed impossibly distant now. Villagers would whisper for years of a gaunt figure glimpsed on lonely roads, always accompanied by a writhing swarm of rats that followed him like loyal hounds. Once, he had mocked them as vermin, laughed at their cleverness, called them filthy scavengers. Now, he walked among them as kin, saved by what he had once despised. As he disappeared into the shadowed trees, he heard the faint strains of carnival music drifting on the wind. The same notes he'd played over and over again in solitude. The tune was sour sweet, a memory of joy and light in the darkness. He allowed himself a small smile, stepping toward it without fear, flanked by the creatures who had been his salvation. In that night, he understood the truth he had ignored for so long. Small acts, small lives, small beings, they could carry the weight of miracles, even when all the world seemed set against you. Moral of the story: mock not the small. What you scorn may one day free you from the hangman's rope.